So let's begin our new lesson, lesson 4. Lesson 4, we're going to talk about factors, multiples, exponents, order of operations, and we're also going to be evaluating expressions. Before I do that, though, I do want to review some stuff that we did in lessons 1 and 2, and I don't think we're getting much into 3, but just mainly some of the stuff in lesson 1 and 2. So if we want to perform the indicator operations, a lot of times we think the operations have to be adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, but as you'll see, operations can take on many different forms. So to do number 1, you got to remember the dash, if you recall, a dash outside the parentheses, or even the absolute value for that matter, that still means the opposite of. So see how this dash is outside the parentheses. So this tells me to take the opposite of a 12. And the opposite of a 12 is then going to be a negative 12. So that would be our answer. So the operation is to take the opposite of a 12. Notice how we have a dash outside the parentheses again. This means to take the opposite of a negative 25. And the opposite of a negative 25 is therefore a positive 25. These are absolute value symbols. And remember, absolute value is how far a number is from 0. So it's always going to be a positive number or 0. So the absolute value of 15 means how far is 15 from 0? Well, it's just simply 15 units from 0, or just write 15 down. The absolute value of negative 40 just means how far is negative 40 from 0? Well, it would just be 40 units. So again, we just write it as a positive value. Question 5, we have to do 2 things. We actually got to do the absolute value first. So the absolute value of 20 is 20, but I still got to take the opposite of that. So there's actually 2 operations here. I got to do the absolute value first, which turns into a 20, and then I got to take the opposite of 20, which turns into a negative 20. So here I got to take the absolute value of negative 14, which turns into a positive 14, but then I got to take the opposite of a 14. And the opposite of 14 is then a negative 14. So that actually has to do both operations. So the absolute value has got to be done first, and then we do the opposite of that second. So that's kind of a little bit of review of the opposite and the absolute value. So we also review adding and subtracting integers. Remember, integers are those positive and negative whole numbers. So like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, so forth and so on. Also like negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, so forth and so on. Those are your integers. And when we get into integers, one of the things we talked about is use a label. So a positive integer, we want to use money that I have. And let me go ahead and get my pencil going here. So a positive integer is money that I have. A negative integer is going to be money that I owe. And 0 basically means you don't have anything, nor do you owe anything. And one of the rules we said about adding integers is if it's the same signs, all you really got to do is just add and keep the label. If the signs are different, you basically subtract, but you got to keep the bigger label. So in these problems right here, I owe 20 and I owe 40. So notice that the labels are the same, the signs are the same. So all I really have to do is add. So all I have to do is add a 45 and a 25. I'm sorry, and a 20. So 45 and a 20 would turn into a 65. So I do the math. So when I come over here, I did my addition, but I got to still pay attention to the label. And since it was a debt and a debt, we have to still keep that negative there. So that's what this means, is keep the label. So if they're both negative, you add them and keep the negative in the problem. So if I have a negative 18 and a negative 28, it's the same concept. The signs are the same. So you have to add the 28 and the 18. So 28 and 18, we get our 16 there, and then we get a 4. So we'll get 46, but we have to keep the label. So it's going to be a negative 46. So if we have a 45 and a negative 60, notice how the signs are different. So this is a subtraction problem. So when you subtract, you always got to use the bigger number on top. So 60 is going to be taken away the 45. So when I subtract that, I'm ignoring the labels. I'm just looking at them as numbers. So I have to borrow there, make that a 5, and this becomes then a 10. So 10 minus 5 is just 5, and then 5 minus 4 would be 1. That'd be 15. So I did my subtraction, and I got 15, but I got to keep the bigger label. So notice that I only had $45. That's only going to remove some of my debt. I'm still going to remain in debt. So the bigger label has to still remain. So it's going to still be, I owe $15. So if I have a 32 and a 54, notice how the signs are different. So again, I subtract 54 and I take away the 32. And when I do that subtraction, I end up with 12. Actually, 22, my fault. So I get a 22 there. But you got to keep the bigger label. And since it was more positive, it stays positive. The answer is a positive 22. So your money that you owe does not override what you have. So you're still going to have $22 left over. So again, if the signs are different, it's simply a subtraction problem, but you want to keep the bigger label. And since it's more positive, the bigger label is going to stay positive. With subtraction, remember, subtraction, we rewrite using an equivalent addition problem, using either the KCC or the circle method. So the KCC basically means you keep the 18, you can change subtraction to addition as long as you change the second number to its opposite. And the opposite of 24 is going to be a negative 24. So once I change it to an addition problem, I follow the rules of addition. Since the signs are different, this is a subtraction problem. So 24 minus 18. So 24 minus 18, we can kind of borrow there, and 14 minus 8 would be 6. So we would end up with the 6. But remember, we got to keep the bigger label. And since I owe more money than I have, the bigger label says to keep it negative. So negative 6 is your answer there. On this one, I'm going to use the circle method. The circle method just says you circle the first term. When you circle the second term, you include the operation. So the two terms then become a negative 10 and a negative 15, because you always add terms. And since the signs are the same, you add, that's going to be a 25, and you keep the label, it's going to be a negative 25. So on the next one, I'm going to use the KCC method. So you can keep the 14, you can change subtraction to addition, as long as you change a negative 24 to a positive 24. And since those are both positive, you just add and keep them positive. And that just turns into a 38. And then if I have 0 take away negative 15, I can use the circle method if I want. So I can circle the 0. And when I circle the next term, you have to include the subtraction symbol with that. So what I have then is a 0 plus, but also the second term is actually the opposite of a negative 15, which is really the same thing as a positive 15. So when I rewrite it, it just turns into 0 plus 15, and 0 plus 15 is just simply 15. So that's a review of adding and subtracting. So this slide, we're going to talk about ordering integers, and also we're going to talk about these three symbols here, the less than symbol, the greater than symbol, or equal to symbol. So if I want to range from least to greatest, that means a range from like the smallest to the largest. And remember, the bigger the debt is, the smaller the value. So in negative numbers, the negative 25 would go first since it's the biggest debt. And then I'm seeing a negative 15 as my next worst debt. And then I'm seeing a negative 4 as my next worst debt. Then 0 means that's better than not owing money. but it's not as good as having money. So 0 is more than negative numbers. And then I'm moving on to this positive side. It looks like you have the 7 would be my next greatest value. Then I would have the 19. And then I would have the 40. So that would be arranged from smallest to largest, or in other words, least to greatest. Now, if I will arrange from greatest to least, I have to look for the biggest number, which is the positive numbers first. So that 60 would go first. It's the largest number I see. I then look at it and I see the 45. I see then the 18. I don't see any more positive numbers. So 0 would be the next number because that's not as good as having money, but it's better than owing money. So as far as the debts go, I got to go from the smallest debt to the biggest debt. So -1 is not a very bad debt. -12 is worse than that, but -20 would be the worst of all. So -20 would be the smallest value. So that would be from largest to smallest. And sometimes if you put them on a number line, that would also help you see how things work as well. Compare the following, use less than, greater than, or equal to. So remember, this is the less than symbol, this is the greater than symbol. Also, if you get lost, always think like an alligator. It always eats the larger value. So -15 and a -6, the -6 is actually the larger value. So -15 would be less than -6. 0 is actually more than -12, so I eat the 0, which means 0 is greater than -12. This one I've got a little bit of work to do before I can actually do it. So the opposite of 6 is actually a -6, and the opposite of -7 is actually a +7. So I have to turn this problem into this problem. And then I can see that the 7 is the larger value, so -6 is less than 7. Here I got to do absolute values. So we know that the absolute value of -23 is going to be, how far is -23 from 0? Well, that'd just be 23. Because remember, absolute value always turns it into a positive number or 0. And when I do this one, the absolute value of 23 is 23, but you still got to take the opposite of that. So that turns into a -23. So this has two operations. I got to take the absolute value and take the opposite. So it ends up being a -23. So the positive number is greater than the negative number. So 23 is greater than -23. That's what that would look like. So one more review. Let's talk about multiplying and dividing integers. Again, as we said, think like a light switch. If there's one negative, it flips it to a negative. The second negative flips it to a positive. The third negative flips it back to a negative. The fourth negative flips it back to a positive. It just kind of goes back and forth. So a little highlight here is if there's an even number of negatives, the answer will always be positive. So if there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, if there's that many negatives in the problem, it's going to always flip it back to a positive answer. If there's an odd number of negatives, then the answer will always be negative. So if there's an odd number of negatives, the answer will always be negative. So if there's like 1 negative or 3 negatives or 5 negatives, that's going to end back up on, the light switch is going to end up on a negative value again. So when I do this problem, basically we just ignore the sign and we just do 12 times 18, or 12 times 8. So 12 times 8, I can use the shortcut if I don't know that answer. Oops, got too low on the board here. Get a little bit higher up here. So if I do 12 times 8, 8 times 2 is 16. I carry my 1. 8 times 1 is 8 plus 1 more makes 9, so that would be 96. So as a light switch, one negative flips it to a negative, the second negative flips it back to a positive. Or in other words, if there's 2 negatives, an even number of negatives makes it a positive. So 9 times -10, well, 9 times 10 is 90. And since there's only one negative problem, that's going to flip it to a negative, so -90. So 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. So 2 times 2 times 2 is what I'm focusing on. Well, 2 times 2 is 4, and 4 times 2 is 8. And since there's two negatives, it flips from a negative back to a positive, so the answer would be a positive 8. Division follows the same rules. 45 divided by 9 is how many 9s does it take to get 45? So if you do your 9 facts, you would see that it takes 5 9s to get to 45. But since there's only one negative, that's going to flip it to a negative 5. Negative 49 divided by negative 7, you could do the tic-tac-toe board to do that. But we do know that 7 7s is 49. And since there's two negatives involved, that would leave me as a positive 7. So there's a quick review then of working with lessons 1 and 2.